Feelings of guilt are common in PTSD. In this video, we're going to cover some of the key interventions in cognitive therapy that we use to target guilt and self-blame. Please note that all of this work is closely interwoven with the updating memories work. This video covers appraisals that link to guilt and self-blame, spotting cognitive biases, the aims of cognitive restructuring, helpful questions to ask, working with hindsight bias, responsibility pie charts, surveys, exploring other actions, addressing maintaining behaviours and cognitive strategies, letting go of guilt, and helping people who are responsible. Let's start by looking at some of the appraisals that lead to a feeling of guilt. Guilt is usually related to an inflated sense of responsibility and self-blame about a number of things. This can include the fact that the trauma happened at all, the fact that the person survived the event, either their actions or perceived failures to act during an event, or possibly a perceived failure to overcome the symptoms of PTSD itself. Guilt often leads to shoulds, so look out for should thoughts like I should have done X or Y, or I should not have done something during the trauma. If the person is responsible, we work on overgeneralization, and we'll come back to that towards the end of this video. It is worth noting that shame is often involved when a patient feels guilty, so look out for this and address it where needed. There is another video available on working with shame on the Cadet Resources website. A really key point is that details emerging from work on the trauma memory are often crucial in generating evidence for cognitive restructuring and then updating those trauma memories. A good example of this can be found in the video on doing a site visit on the Cadet Resources website. Here, the therapist and patient discover information at the site of the trauma that explains why the patient behaved in a particular way during her assault, and this helps to update her appraisal that she was at fault for the trauma because of her actions. Here is a brief extract from that video.
So this is the spot where you tried to run away, is that right?
Yeah, I remember now. It was right by this tree.
Okay. And we've talked a bit before about why you ran down towards the river instead of back up towards the road.
Yeah, it seemed like such a stupid decision because I could have run towards the road where there might have been more people, but instead I ran deeper into the park.
Okay. And now that we're here, what do you notice?
Well, the road's a lot further away than I thought it was,
Yeah.
and it would have been dark, so I might not have been able to see that gate.
Yeah. Are there any street lights around here?
I can't see any.
No, me neither, so it would have been quite dark.
Yeah, and at that time the gate was probably locked, so I might not have got out that way anyway.
That's true.
And the fence is a lot higher than I thought.
Okay. Do you think you would have been able to climb over it?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. That's interesting. So you've wondered a lot why you made that decision, but now that we're here we can see that the road's a bit further away than you thought. In the dark you might not have been able to see the gate, and it might have been locked at that time anyway, so you might not have been able to get out that way.
Yeah, I don't think it would have helped if I'd run towards the road. And maybe there was lights by the river, so that's why I ran that way.
That would make sense, yeah. So what do you think now about that decision that you made?
Well, I can see why I made it now.
Okay. And you've been quite critical of yourself in the past for running in that way.
Yeah, I felt really annoyed with myself. I felt like if I'd just been smarter I could have got away, but I can see why I made that decision now.
When a patient is feeling guilty, they tend to be totally focused on their contribution to the trauma and its outcome. In therapy, we help them by widening this perspective. Cognitive biases provide helpful clues to how the personal meanings can be restructured. Before we get into the key interventions of cognitive restructuring, it's worth us mentioning a number of biases and thinking errors that it's helpful for therapists to be aware of. These include discounting and screening out other explanations, such as a person blaming themselves for not calling for help at the time, but not taking account of the fact they were being threatened by a weapon. Hindsight bias, such as a patient who was sexually assaulted, judging their actions based on what they know now rather than what they knew at the time of the trauma. Minimizing the person's own experience or symptoms at the time. An example here might be a person minimising their own shock and injuries after an accident and then blaming themselves for not rushing to save other people. Discounting positive action. The example here would be our paramedic, who was ignoring all the things they did to try and save a patient who later passed away. Not thinking through alternative actions. So this may include an example of a manager whose store was robbed, blaming himself for not fighting back, not really considering that fighting back could have led to further casualties. And superhuman standards. For example, a mother expecting herself to have sensed that her baby was in distress during birth and birthing the baby sooner. Finally, emotional reasoning, such as the person using the feelings of guilt to mean that they are indeed guilty. There are a number of aims of cognitive restructuring. These include increasing awareness of the factors that led to the event, especially related to the perpetrator when it comes to interpersonal trauma. Increasing awareness of reasons that explained the patient's behaviour and reactions at the time. Patients often have hardly any time to decide what to do and are in a state of shock. Increasing awareness of what patients did that was helpful because they're usually not thinking about this. And considering other actions that would not necessarily have led to better outcomes. There are a number of helpful questions we can ask. For example, what other explanations might there be? Who else was involved? How much power did you actually have to influence what happened? How did things appear to you at the time? What was the reason for acting as you did at the time? How could you have known what was going to happen? How much time for reflection and choosing the best course of action did you have? What was your emotional and physical state at the time? What did you do that was helpful? If this was another person, what would you expect of them and how would you explain their behaviour? Apart from your feelings, what else might you take into account when considering how you acted? It is really important in therapy to focus on what information patients had at the time. Careful examination of the narrative and drawing out timelines and visualizations of how things looked at the time can be helpful. There is a useful sequence of Socratic questions to address the hindsight bias. When did you know what was going to happen? Was there any way to predict what was going to happen? What would you have done if you knew what was going to happen? And what was the main reason you did X and not Y? This can be linked to the then versus now approach, helping people see the information they knew then versus what they know now. We're now going to see a short video demonstrating the hindsight bias in this sequence of questioning.
I keep thinking, if only I hadn't gone, this would never have happened. Other girls would never have been so stupid. It really is my fault.
So if I understand that correctly, Isabel, it sounds like you're feeling responsible for the rape because you visited him at his home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't gone.
So on a scale of 0 to 100%, how much do you believe you're responsible for the rape?
Oh, at least 80%.
Right, okay, that's quite high, isn't it? So let's think back to the time before it happened, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
When he first asked you to come over for breakfast on the Sunday, were there any signs of his intentions at that point, Isabel?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he'd been really nice to me up until then.
Right, so he'd been nice up until then. So when was the time when you first realised you were going to be raped?
I think it was the moment when he locked the door and took away the key. It was until then.
Okay, so you didn't actually know his intentions then before you got into the house?
Yeah, no, I didn't, that's right.
Isabel, if you had known at that point, before going into the house, before agreeing to visit him, that he was going to rape you, do you think you would have gone?
No, of course not, no.
So what was the main reason then that you agreed to go and visit him rather than avoiding him?
Well, he'd been really nice up until then. We'd been seeing each other for a little while, and I was attracted to him. I mean, it never occurred to me that he was going to be violent.
Right, okay. So it didn't occur to you he was going to be violent. So is it fair to say that at the time when you agreed to visit, you could have had no idea what was going to happen?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, there were no signs at all that was going to happen.
So if you consider, Isabel, what you knew before going into the house, okay, how responsible do you believe you were for the rape on a scale of 0 to 100%?
Responsibility pie charts can be a powerful way for people to discover that they are overestimating their sense of responsibility for the event. A detailed reconstruction of the trauma can reveal a range of factors that are relevant, and it's useful to consider all of these factors simultaneously in a pie chart. This can be done in a number of steps. We start by getting the patient to rate the percentage extent to which they believe they are responsible. Here on the screen, for example, we see that the patient started feeling she was 100% responsible for a road traffic accident. We then generate a list of possible other factors that could have contributed to the event. For example, here, the other driver, slippery roads, night time being poor visibility. We then rate each of the other factors for the extent to which they are responsible for the event and add these to the pie chart. After all the other factors have been assigned a percentage, the remaining percentage is assigned to the client's actions and we add them to the chart. Here you can see the patient started feeling 100% responsible, but actually on the pie chart she's only 10% responsible. I'm now going to show you a video clip demonstrating this in therapy.
If you had to rate between kind of 0 and 100, kind of how much of the responsibility you think is yours, where would you put it?
It was all my fault.
So 100%, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the next step, the patient and therapist generate a list of other factors that contributed to the event. This may take some time and will involve a need to explore the details of the event or events.
Serena, I'd like for us to have a little more of a think about kind of how this awful event kind of sort of came about. Are there any other reasons that it happened, do you think?
Well, I just should have stopped her from running out.
Okay. Can you just tell me a bit more about kind of, how it happened, what happened? Serena, what about the driver of the van? Does he have any responsibility?
Yeah, he does have responsibility as well.
And there are any other kind of factors that kind of have some responsibility for what happened?
Well, there was one thing we found out at the inquest that he'd been driving around without one of his wing mirrors. It had been knocked off.
What impact did that have?
Well, I guess he couldn't properly see her when he was reversing.
Okay, that's awful. So that's also partly responsible.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe let's have a think perhaps about how come the van didn't have a wing mirror as well.
Okay.
Together, Rena and the therapist identify a range of people and contexts that have some responsibility for events that led to her daughter's death. The therapist asks the patient to rate each of the other factors for the extent to which they are responsible for the event, and enters these estimates into the pie chart.
So, roughly how much responsibility does the van driver have, do you think, Rena?
I think it's quite a lot. I think it's got to be 50% maybe, or maybe a bit more than that. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, should we put up sort of 50% for the moment? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can always come back to these. So let's put it kind of up for the moment.
Okay.
How about the company looking after the van's maintenance?
It's a hard one because, I mean, they did let them drive around like that for quite a long time from the sounds of things. But it's also hard because I don't know what happened.
No, sure.
But 25% maybe.
Looking at all these kind of factors, and sort of even before we've got to you, it's already kind of well over 100%. I'm just wondering what we can make of that.
I guess I know what you're trying to say, but it still doesn't feel. I mean, it just still feels like it's my fault.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I guess what I'm just wondering, and that, that's quite natural. But I mean, what do you make of the fact that even before we've got to you, we've kind of sort of filled up the pie? We're going to sort of actually kind of draw it out.
Yeah. What I guess looking at this, I guess it suggests it's not all my fault.
No, I mean, I guess that would be pretty tricky now.
Yeah,
given the other factors.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you give yourself right now?
I think it's got to be at least as much as my partner, so probably 20%, I think.
Okay, so you're thinking kind of for you also 20%.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's put that up for the moment, and then let's work out the other percentages so we can get it kind of to 100%, and then we can have a look at sort of kind of what that looks like when we've kind of sort of worked it out.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
The therapist asks the patient to re-rate the belief that they are to blame for the trauma.
So looking at this now, Rena, how do you feel?
I don't know. I do feel a little bit better. It's quite a nice change for me to start thinking about this a bit differently. I mean, I still feel guilty. I still feel responsible, but I'm starting to feel a bit differently about it.
Okay. And
Patient testimony using pie charts. This patient is a paramedic whose colleague attempted suicide after a night out. The trauma triggered an earlier event. The patient's brother had died by suicide. The patient believed he should have acted quicker or even prevented his colleague's attempted suicide because of his past life experience, and also because he was sober when others who tried to help were drunk. Here, he talks about how the pie chart helped him.
I was accounting too much responsibility for what happened to myself when I shouldn't have. And a good way that you would help me reevaluate that was through a responsibility pie chart. So you asked me to make a pie chart about who holds their own percentage of responsibility for what happened. So in brief, to keep it anonymous, but in brief, what happened was we had to force entry to the colleague who had attempted suicide. And the thing that I was feeling guilty about was I took too long to decide to force entry. And because it was such a time-critical event, every second counts. So I was counting afterwards, in hindsight, I was counting seconds. And I thought because ultimately it fell down to me to make that decision because everyone else was preoccupied or drunk or whatever. And I was the only one sober at the time. I felt like I would hold the majority of responsibility. So in brief, the pie chart looked something like this. There were 3 other people with me who helped me force entry. And so first person, I gave her 20%, second person, 20%, third person, 20%. Last person, me, I gave 40% because I was the sober one. So I thought, logically speaking, I have the most responsibility. And because I had a similar situation in the past where my brother was unresponsive in his room, I just thought he was asleep. So I just waited, 6 hours later, where I finally thought something's wrong here and I forced entry, but he was long gone at that point. Because I had that previous experience, I thought I should have learned from last time and I should have decided quicker. So I gave 40% to myself in that pie chart, so majority was on me. The issue with that, though, is I wasn't accounting for the actual person who attempted suicide. How much responsibility does he hold? So once you had brought that up, you'd ask me, so how much responsibility does he have? Up until that point, I'd never even thought about that. But when you asked me, it sort of made something click in my head where I realized I was being unfair, because at the end of the day, he's the one who decided to do that. Not me, not anyone else. He's the one who put himself in that position. and we can only do so much to mitigate that. So once I accounted for him, a lot, like the percentage on me reduced quite a bit. And then you had pointed out how, yes, I was sober, but it was 4 o'clock in the morning. So I wasn't exactly in the best frame of mind either. So that was another factor which would alleviate some of my responsibility. And then another factor which I wasn't really accounting for was how I can't just knock someone's door down the moment they don't respond, especially when alcohol's involved, because your first line of thought is, probably just passed out from alcohol. Why should I kick his door down? So with all these extra things that I weren't accounting for, once you put them at the forefront of my mind, I was able to drastically reduce the percentage of responsibility that I had initially accounted to myself, and that was a huge help for that was a huge way to sort of alleviate some of that guilt.
Other interventions that can be useful include surveys to discover what other people would say about what a patient did or did not do during a trauma. Here, we would usually share an anonymised vignette explaining some key details of what happened in the trauma, and then ask people what would they think of Mo, for example. How responsible do you think he was? Who was responsible? Do you think this meant Mo was worthless, or whatever the patient believes about themselves? What would you say to him if he was your friend? A video of this technique can be found on the Oxford Resources website. Exploring other actions. When patients ruminate about things they think they should have done, it can be very helpful to explore in detail actions that were not taken, as it often emerges that if these actions had been taken, they either would not have changed the outcome of the trauma or could have made events much worse. For example, a shop manager who thought he should have tried to prevent an armed robbery realised through discussion that if he had tried to intervene, some of his staff could have been shot and killed. This discussion can sometimes be enhanced by restaging the event, retracing the patient's movements and actions, and systematically going through alternatives. For some patients, imagining the alternative actions and their consequences can be helpful for realising the likely outcomes. Common maintaining processes to address include rumination, self-criticism, avoidance, such as acting as if the person is guilty or unworthy, and withdrawal from others, often based on fears of what other people might think. These can be targeted with standard interventions for rumination or self-criticism, such as exploring the advantages and disadvantages of these processes, labelling that process, and then disengaging with it. Writing a compassionate letter to the self can be helpful for people who are highly self-critical. It might be useful to try a reverse role play or compassionate imagery exercise first to help the patient get into a more compassionate mindset. Reclaiming or building a life activities to ensure patients are engaging with doing things that show them they are worthy of living a guilt-free life are really important. Behavioural experiments to test out any fears people may have, for example, telling other people about the trauma if they fear negative reactions related to their self-blame. Letting go of guilt. Some patients have blocking beliefs that maintain guilt and need addressing to help them let go of it. To help identify these, it can be useful to ask, what would it mean if you didn't feel guilty as much or any longer? Here are a number of common blocking thoughts and more helpful reappraisals. Helping patients think about what they would say to a loved one or a friend when working on this can be really helpful. Common thoughts include, I did something wrong, I should feel guilty about it, and could be reappraised to something like, feeling guilty stops me from getting on with my life and doesn't help anybody. Or letting go of guilt would mean I get away with it and that's not fair, which could be appraised to, I've suffered with PTSD a long time and I've not gotten away with it. Or if I feel guilty, it proves I care, which could be reappraised to stopping feeling guilty does not mean I don't care. How can I show my care in other ways? Finally, if I stop believing I'm responsible, I'll have to accept that many things aren't under my control, and that makes the world feel more dangerous. Reappraised to something like, believing all is under my control is unrealistic. The world is not more dangerous than it was before the trauma. Some people with PTSD are responsible for the trauma in some ways. This may involve driving whilst drinking and then being involved in an accident, being involved in a war zone, or deliberately harming another person. The fact that the person is feeling guilty about their behaviour is often a sign that their behaviour does not link to their current goals or values. Whatever the level of actual responsibility, clients often still overestimate their contribution or do not take into account other factors that may have also led to their behaviour. Here, the therapist uses many of the same methods that we've gone through in this video. This includes discussion of hindsight bias and other biases through Socratic questioning, the use of pie charts, and the use of observer perspective imagery. Discussing the details of the context of the client's behaviour is particularly helpful. For example, here we see a pie chart which helped a soldier who was feeling very guilty about accidentally shooting a child in combat. The therapist and patient together look at some other factors that hold some responsibility and explore the context of his behaviours. For example, he was stressed, fearful, in danger himself, on high alert and exhausted. He had not intentionally harmed the child. Once a level of responsibility has been agreed, the therapist and patient then consider ways in which the patient can live with this experience and what it means about them as a person and their future. This will most likely involve a discussion of former and present values. Overgeneralizations such as "this shows I'll always be a bad person because of what I did" are challenged. In some circumstances, this may also involve making some reparations in a way that is meaningful to the patient or is consistent with the traumatic event they experienced. For example, a patient who was partly responsible for a car crash decided to become involved with campaigning for safer roads and helping families after road traffic accidents. In letting go of guilt, it can be helpful to ask, when people have committed a crime, they receive a sentence, and this sentence is for a limited amount of time. When do you think you will have felt guilty long enough to have served your sentence? In summary, the key interventions when working with guilt in no set order involve spotting thoughts that are related to guilt and elaborating these in trauma memory. Working on cognitive restructuring using guided discovery, pie charts, surveys, and considering other actions, etc. Updating trauma memories and working on letting go of guilt. It is important to keep track of guilt appraisals throughout therapy by looking at questionnaires such as the PTCI and also asking patients to give you belief ratings about their particular appraisals. Really important to help you keep track of things and ensure that things are shifting and progressing.